J'ai compris.
Okay, working.
Hang on. I've got. Is it okay if I leave it like that? Because I always run into the same difficulty with my computer. If I put it on diaporama, I can't see anything else on my screen.
It's fine by me.
I hope you can all see it, even if it's smaller. The slides are smaller.
Yeah, I think
if there's a problem, just wave behind your camera.
I think it's
For those
fine.
of you who still got the cameras on. Anyway, hi. So this is a paper that takes us back a few years when the debate around so-called thick and or rather versus thin liberalism was in full swing. I'm not sure whether the best way to frame the whole thing, for the sake of clarity, and clarity is going to be my goal that I'm not going to reach, I'm afraid. But I'm not saying if it's better to speak of one debate in the singular with different moments and offshoots of that very debate, or whether it's better to say that there are several debates going on at the same time. And after much reflection, I've decided that it doesn't really matter, as long as you get the general picture. That is a very large conversation with multiple contributors, and definitely subparts, sub-conversations going on, functioning independently, but fueling one another. So given the scope of this debate, I can only offer a very partial, truncated view. So my apologies in advance for my many omissions. I mean, I'm sure you could tell me you didn't speak about this, you forgot about that. I did, obviously I did. Also, for the same reason, the sheer size of the debate, I'm looking for coherence here. So I've tried to be coherent and present the debate as a whole, but I cannot avoid at some point loose ends or failing to connect everything together. And I apologize in advance for that as well. Anyway, so the most obvious issues here were the communitarian critique of liberals, a conversation between non-liberals and liberals, as well at the same time as a conversation between liberals. So within liberalism, a conversation about pluralism. The bulk of the debate took place roughly from the 80s to the 2000s, with the peak years clearly situated in the 90s. But of course, the origins and the consequences of the debate span over a much larger period. So you could say the debate is now more or less over. There's still some people contributing, but you know, the whole debate is kind of over. And as is often the case with philosophical debates, there's no clear outcome. It's been quite inconclusive. But eventually the debate receded, that we know. And in a way, thank God, because it was kind of tedious at some point. Of course, it didn't leave things the way they were before the debate. And that's what's interesting here. It identified problems. It raised awareness to moot points. And definitely it contributed to the evolution of liberal theory, or at least to the clarification or the redefinition of some of its main tenets, including individuality and liberty, that is to say, good old individual freedom. So this is my very brief outline in case you get lost. And I'd like to start with my first point. So the overview of the debate, what was going on there? So of course, it's no coincidence that the debate emerged when it did, because, you know, almost a perfect case study for for historians of ideas, the historical context was the growth of multicultural societies following mass immigration in the post-war decades. But you could examine the context in the question of the context in more depth. You could look at the collapse of traditional societies organized around small, stable communities, local life, as opposed to life in big anonymous cities. And you could see some connection there as well to explain why the debate just came to life at one point. At least as far as the communitarian side is concerned. You could also look at it from another angle by focusing on the evolution of political theory and how one thing led to another within this particular context. In that case, you would definitely go back to the huge milestone that was Rawls' theory of justice, which triggered, as we all know, an intense renewed interest for high political philosophy. Sort of all-encompassing theories that aim to produce a kind of a final word on things, a theoretical script policies can be modeled on. Definitely communitarianism was a response to that as well. And by the way, it's widely accepted that Rawls himself was influenced by the communitarian critique. As political liberalism, which was published 20 years later, is usually said to be an attempt to reinterpret the theory of justice in the light of the communitarian critique. So as you see, this debate was not without its consequences. So having noted the historical and theoretical context of emergence, I must warn you in advance that it's quite difficult to come up with a satisfactory, precise definition of communitarianism, let alone a precise definition of liberalism, but I'm not even going to try and get into that. Why is it difficult to define communitarianism? Well, for many reasons, but two are very important. First of all, there is no overall agreement between them. They don't speak as they don't see themselves as belonging to a school of some thought. And second of all, some of them, most of them, even reject the label communitarianism. They don't like it. So labeling someone a communitarian is always an outside job. And there are limits there too. I'm still going to use the term because, you know, I need a word. So I'm going to take that one. So what is meant, however, by the label communitarianism is really a sort of a common, consistent, not 100% consistent, but broadly, the bulk of it is consistent, critique of liberalism. There is the critique, and that's my second point, of the liberal conception of the individual. Now, both Taylor and McIntyre, for instance, retrace the development of modern liberalism and note the relevant development of the liberal notion of the individual. This is seen as a major sort of core of liberalism, and indeed it is. They point to, they go as far back as the Augustinian turn to self, this sort of an inward gaze at the self, where one's personal relationship with God is said to be likely to lead to a fulfilling life. Also at work in setting the scene for liberalism's development was the increasing acceptance of individual autonomy in matters of self-definition, notably with the Reformation, of course, that made room for choice, at least choice in religious matters. And then they see another major step in the sort of molding of the liberal individual, and that is the crucial contribution of Descartes, more or less the last straw, if you like, when Descartes bound up autonomy with the exercise of rational power. So there you have it, the rational liberal individual was born. Now, if you think of the cogito and the steps Descartes takes to reach the conclusion cogito ergo sum, you see a solitary individual as the basis of self. Everything else that constitutes the self is rejected to boil down to thought. And this would then be the basis for the individual. And everything else is added onto that, onto the core autonomous, intellectual, rational mind. From then on, you reach the Enlightenment, which puts a growing emphasis on the unique character of the individual. For instance, as put forward by Herder in the 18th century. So this is the individual that the communitarian critique reproaches liberalism with. A kind of an illusion of a solitary agent making choices for his or herself, an autonomous individual who, on top of everything else, gradually distances themselves from morality, especially as science and even scientism pushes back faith outside of the picture, or at least to the margins of the picture, and fosters an instrumental relationship with the outside, be it with objects, with nature, which becomes, a basis for consumption, and even with people, other people. So, oh yeah, and of course there's capitalism. At the end of the road, you reach capitalism. Anyway, but this conception, according to the communitarians, this conception of the individual is a major mistake. It's wrong. It's mistaken. Because, first of all, it neglects the role played by social interaction in the creation of self. Communitarians insist a lot on the fact that there is no such thing as an autonomous, solitary self. Self is developed through social interaction. A person is made by socializing. That's not super original, I'm afraid, but they insist on it, and they say that liberalism has lost sight of that. Man is a social animal, if you like. But of course, liberals have never denied that. And a big part of the debate is about a misunderstanding of each position. Communitarians, when they say that, the abstract individual disconnected from their surroundings is more a myth than a reality. I personally have never seen it anywhere, that abstract individual. I don't know where it came from. It is, however, true that you can't be liberal. You can't be liberal if you don't believe that there is an individual, if you don't posit an individual that can escape heteronomy, that is not, that has a shot at becoming autonomous. I'm not sure everybody understands the word heteronomy. If you don't, probably the best thing to do is to think of a child, you know, like an 8-year-old that can function, but for big question, they'll turn to their parent and ask what they're supposed to do. Okay, they depend on the judgment of someone else to be able to lead their lives. That's heteronomy. So Neil and Paris explain this very clearly in a very interesting article. Never mind. The question they asked is, are shared relations contingent or essential for the individual? Is there a level of personal identity that remains independent from relationships, or do these relationships actually constitute the self? If you're liberal, then you'll have to say that they're contingent. That's true. Only communitarians would go as far as saying that shared relations are essential to the self, that there is no self without shared relation. There is no Robinson Crusoe from their point of view. But of course, that doesn't mean that liberalism denies the validity of sociology. Okay? So I go back to the communitarian critique now, to the second point of the communitarian critique about the individual. I hope you guys are still with me. So another thing that they reproach the liberal individual with is that too much emphasis, in their view, too much emphasis has been put on choice. Freedom of choice, do what you want, do your own thing, you know, all these things, okay? And not enough emphasis has been put on the quality of choice, the moral quality of choice. We're making a choice, we can make our choices all the time, but are they good ones? Are we making the good choice? Nobody really cares about this in liberalism, say the communitarians, of course. So furthermore, this is a quote, the traditional liberal conception of community is a group of people who join forces in order to increase the odds for success in the individual pursuit of self-interest. You can easily go back to contractual philosophy, to Locke, for instance, and then the passage from the state of nature to the civil state to see this. That's how it's described exactly. Okay, so when construed in this fashion, the result is a society marked by fragile commitments between people, an inadequate system of social support, and consequently uncertainty and anxiety. The picture the communitarians paint of the liberal world is always a bit bleak, I have to admit, and the reverse is true as well. So, and what's even worse, because of this lack of ties, this lack of attachment, if you like, to others, in the absence of interlocking obligations among people, keeping domestic tranquility becomes a never more difficult task. So you get criminals, you know. By allowing this to happen, liberal societies have cast us adrift in a sort of a moral life where even if we are free to make moral choices for ourselves, we're not encouraged to learn to make the right moral decisions because we lack the training, we lack the support, we lack the education, we lack a moral frame, if you like. And so we've lost sight of our obligations to our community, including to other people's safety and general well-being. That's the bulk of their argument. In trying to identify, and I move to my third part, which is much longer than all the other ones. In trying to identify what goes wrong in practice and move away from abstract political theory, communitarians challenged a core principle of liberalism, namely the primacy of the right over the good. What does this mean? Honestly, once again, the answer is super complicated, and I've tried to sort of encapsulate it, but it's not easy. Okay. There are books you can read if you want to get to the bottom of it, but you've got to be very patient. Anyway, briefly told, it is a capital distinction between two structurally different things. What is right is what is a principle of justice, what is fair. Of course, then you want to ask, but what justice? A principle of which justice? And the short answer to that is, it doesn't really matter, any justice. Because justice is structurally different from questions of the good. Justice is concerned with claims that people have against one another. So it is a judgment about competing claims made by different parties. For instance, I've tried to think of an example. That's the only one I came up with. I don't know what it says about me, but never mind. You want to get a divorce. Is it a good idea? Should you? These are not questions for justice. But which part of the common estate should you get? Can your husband stop you from leaving? These are questions for justice. As you see, the difference between those two sorts of questions is that one is concerned with someone else, in that case, your husband or wife, okay? And the others are more like up to you things. So the ones that have to do with competing claims, your husband and your claim are competing in this case, are matters for justice. The rest is up to you to decide on what constitutes the good life. Here, communitarians argue that while the right may be essential to a good society, they don't deny that, we need justice, it is clearly, however, not enough. Some argue that a shared vision of what constitutes a good society, of what constitutes a good life reinforces the community. Some say we have to have some common moral vision of the good that we share. Again, they say that this very frame that is limited to the right encourages individual selfishness, with everyone competing against each other to pursue their own interest and solve, and only interest, and justice is only about solving individual disputes before the courts, rather than working together for a common good. Moreover, the primacy of the right over the good in a liberal society also leads to equal treatment of everyone. Equality before the law is a core principle of justice, of course. And this equal treatment of everyone is also the object of criticism. Regardless, the communitarians blame this equal principle because it doesn't take into account the particular circumstances of people. So in this very broad communitarian critique, with people not always agreeing on everything within it, blah, 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 there is definitely a strong opposition to difference blindness, to being blind to difference. And they say that difference blindness is detrimental, at least to some communities. Some communities suffer because their differences, their specificity are not recognized. For instance, another example, you can decide based on a budget that you should close a fifth of the maternity wards in France. But of course, if you close out of 5 maternity wards in a big city, the impact will be very, very different from closing 1 maternity in Porto-Vecchio in Corsica. This is a recent example, as you must know. Okay, because the number of the hours, the time, and the distance that it will imply for people is very different. Okay, and they blame this justice approach as not being able to see this. So what the communitarians advocate in response to that is an autonomy for the communities to make decisions about the good. For instance, locally, we could close the shops on Sundays if we're, all Christians in the area. Then let's close the shops on Sundays. And this community autonomy will allow justice to include a view of the particular, the actual circumstances of the community, their culture, their geography, their beliefs, their whatever. Last but not least, these communitarian claims rely heavily on the questions of participation at the local level. And Emma, I thought about your paper at this point. Participation at the local level, sort of empowering local communities by allowing them to depart from nationwide rules and encouraging citizen participation actively. There are clear echoes, obviously, here of participatory democracy and even republicanism in all of this, of course. And yes, part of the communitarians were really speaking from that point of view. Not all of them, no. I suppose in a way you could say that there's a left-leaning and right-leaning communitarianism, but you can say the exact same thing about liberalism. So there you go. The right and the left are always here voting or for or against the 49.3, and we're having a lot of fun. Sorry. So this is my way of introducing the second main target of the communitarian critique, namely the notion of a neutral state. The neutral state is exactly what this distinction between the right and the good points to. From the liberal point of view, a certain neutrality of the state is the condition for individual freedom on the one hand, and the rule of law on the other, bearing in mind that one makes the other possible. Here, however, I'm sorry, we run into another difficulty. I just want to stop and say that for those of you who are thinking, this is too complicated, you've got no idea of how oversimplified it is. I've made it as simple as I can. It's actually a lot of fun, you know, depending on your definition of fun. So we run into another difficulty because we want to ask, what does it mean, the neutrality of the state? And is there just one kind of neutrality, or can you provide different definitions of neutrality? To try and understand this, I'd like us to go back to the origins of liberalism, where when the first historical manifestation, clear manifestation, thick manifestation of pluralism took place, knowing that pluralism means, and I quote, the recognition of the inevitability of disagreement between competing doctrines of the good. If you go back to the origins of liberalism, then you remember there were the religious wars, and the religious wars were the actual embodiment of this. Within a country, suddenly you had Catholics and Protestants, and you even had diverging Protestants and diverging Catholics. Okay, and so there you go. For a while, people thought you could just slaughter them to silence, but after a moment, they realized you couldn't, and they had to accept that there is such a thing as an inevitable disagreement on conception of the good. So these competing religious doctrines, as you know, were met by proto-liberalism, such as Locke's, by toleration. Toleration became the big answer to that. Toleration, as you know, specifically means the decriminalization of dissenting religious beliefs, and up to a certain extent, dissenting religious practices, only up to a certain extent. Okay, so the distinction in English between toleration and tolerance comes in handy here to remind us that toleration is originally only about religious beliefs. Now, toleration is not neutrality. Neutrality is defined this way by Zelentin, a great book. Neutrality implies that whoever is in a neutral position, in the neutral position, is A, not part of the conflict, having on ethical matters no position, so neutral, and B, in a situation where it can influence the outcome of the conflict nevertheless, so in a situation of power. Should you get a divorce? My position is indifference. And by this I mean, I do have my own thoughts about whether you should get a divorce, but I'm not in a position to decide. I'm not in a position of power. I cannot fulfill B. So that's indifference. Okay. Toleration is actually the other way around. I am in a position of power and I'm not neutral. about your divorce. I definitely think that you should remain married, okay? Neutrality is, I have no position and I am in a position to influence, okay? So you see, there's an important distinction between neutrality, toleration, and indifference. Toleration means, I think you're wrong, but I will not hinder you from going on in your wrong ways, which is a way of taking a stand. So this brief, and I hope clear explanation, pinpoints the critique of toleration that took place in the 20th century, basically, whereby people came to realize that toleration did not meet, even in the 19th century, that toleration did not meet the standard of equal liberty for all. That a tolerating state does not treat citizens as equals. If you're tolerated, despite the fact that you're wrong, you do not get equal respect. You do not get equal recognition. So toleration amounts to creating two classes of citizenship, a good respectable class and a depraved tolerated one. Before I move to what communitarians have to say about the neutrality of the state, I must stop breathe, and add another layer. So bear with me. At the same time as this debate between communitarians and liberals was taking place, there was another debate going on, another part of the debate going on, this time, as I mentioned earlier, between liberals. And this debate was about liberalism actually being accused of lacking neutrality. Namely, liberalism was accused of having a moral bias. In a way, it looks like the opposite of the criticism based on the lack of moral standards, but in fact, it's not so different. Let me try to take us there. So, it takes us back to the question of neutrality again. We've established that if the state embraces one religion, as opposed to all others, it is not neutral. It merely tolerates dissenting religions, okay? And there will always come a point when a difference is made between those with the right religion, Church of England, and those with the wrong one, Catholics. Well, you could argue that this is also true of philosophical and or moral outlooks on life. So in that way, isn't liberalism just a moral doctrine? Isn't the view of a free, autonomous individual just another worldview that you are unjustly promoting at the expense of other doctrines? If so, if this is the case, then clearly the liberal state is not neutral, it is a tolerating state. It's caught in the toleration paradigm. So if the state is liberal and holds that individuals should be equal and free, should ideally lead an autonomous life, should, echoing Mill and Humboldt, develop their own abilities and characters, then, as the term should indicates, it is taking sides as to what constitutes the good life. And it is not neutral vis-a-vis the plurality of conceptions of the good life. On the other hand, if it does not seek to promote actively these values, it can leave communities free to decide otherwise if that is their wish. So this is when you understand the title of my presentation, because this is when you start to make a difference between a thin liberalism, minimal principles, also known as political liberalism on the one hand, and on the other hand, a thick liberalism, a comprehensive liberalism, also called a philosophical liberalism. Now, on the surface, thin liberalism seems the better option if you want to be fair, to provide equal treatment to everyone in society, especially in a multicultural society that necessarily includes divergent, comprehensive, global, far-reaching, all-encompassing doctrines of the good. So if you're living in one of these societies, then you shouldn't advocate one specific doctrine, not even the liberal one. So some would go as far as saying is that to be a true liberal, you have to be a thin liberal. I'm not sure I like this sentence for obvious reasons, but never mind. In a way, the communitarian critique highlights this distinction. And if you want to answer that communitarian critiques are not valid, you can say that you stick to thin liberalism, to political liberalism, that you're not taking sides. Okay? Political liberalism is a term that you use, which is more or less a synonym for thin liberalism, but it basically says that you apply liberal principles within the political sphere. When we make decisions together, how we decide, etc., we do that in a liberal paradigm, but then we're free to go back to our non-liberal lives if this is what we want to do. Okay, but we have to have a shrine of liberalism for us to be able to, you know, do politics together. So you have equal vote, free speech, etc. in the political sphere. You don't have to have equality and free speech at home if you don't want to. So then people are left, apart from doing politics together, people for the rest of their lives are left to their own device, with their own roadmap for the good life in every other single aspect of their lives. So thin liberalism doesn't encroach on people's conception of the good life. Can I go on? Say yes, please. Yes. I'm sorry. This is taking longer than I thought.
No, don't worry. I mean, we've got that hour, so carry on.
Okay, there you go. Sorry, it's my way of avoiding questions. You see. Anyway, so far so good. Clear for everyone. Okay, but only apparently, because if you examine it closely, then the possibility of a thin liberalism is a very moot point. I'm not taking sides here, or at least I'm not telling you whose side I'm on. Okay, some people will be actually horrified at the mere phrasing of thin liberalism being a moot point, but let's just say that some people say that thin liberalism is a moot point. What is liberalism? If it's a doctrine, then however thin, it remains a doctrine. And however thinly, it is unfair to other doctrines. Okay. Now, liberals will tell you that's kind of true, yes, no, but one thing they'll tell you is there is something special about liberalism. It is the only doctrine that accommodates other doctrines. It's the only one that makes room for its friends and frenemies and enemies. Okay. Any other doctrine would not leave as much space for dissent and for other doctrines to thrive if that's what they want to do. Put differently, you can't conceive of a political and social organization that would leave as much scope for other diverging doctrines as liberalism. So liberalism from that point of view has been described as a meta doctrine, a framework that accommodates the coexistence of all ideologies. Can I just have a Rawlsian moment? Sorry, I'm losing it there. And qualify what I've just said. When I said other doctrines, I did mean other reasonable doctrines, okay? I don't have time to get into that, but of course there's always the question of just how out there can the accommodated doctrines be? What do you do if you've got this cult that kills babies? Obviously. Okay, so I don't have time to develop the question of reasonable doctrines as opposed to unreasonable ones. It's a difficult question again. But what's interesting here is that what liberalism has done here is it's posited the possibility of a core set of principles embedded in the law, a core set of principles embedded in the law, chosen by overlapping consensus, as Rawls said. In other words, what reasonable people will minimally agree upon. Should we kill babies? No. Okay. In other words, if you accept the idea that there is an overlapping consensus of minimal principles, then you accept the possibility of the erection of a neutral state. Another thing about neutrality is the distinction that was made by Kimlicka. He's a Canadian liberal from the same period, and there was a big input from Canada here, no doubt because of their own national context. Anyway, the distinction between consequential neutrality and justificatory neutrality. Okay, of course the idea is that consequential neutrality is easier to reach than the other one. Okay, anyway, so is it even possible for the state to be built on some kind of doctrine and not foster it, at least indirectly? Is there such a thing as a thin pluralist liberalism? Of course, there have been people, I'm thinking John Gray, who have argued that they were pluralists, but they sort of dropped the liberal in the process. And there's no doubt that you can be a pluralist, but can you be a pluralist liberal is the question to me. This is what quite a few communitarians sort of harped on, as well as other commentators who spoke in favor of comprehensive liberalism. So you have basically two people saying that neutral thing, it doesn't exist. Okay, you're crazy. Both the communitarians, but also the comprehensive liberals, also known as perfectionist liberals. Never mind. Okay, perfectionist liberalism is the clear view that it is perfectly okay, perfectly desirable to have a state value, to have the state judge the value of different conception and to prefer the liberal one, because it's obviously the better one. Okay, that's perfectionism. So from this double critique here, not only did they oppose the neutrality of the state as a principle, communitarians didn't want the state to be neutral, comprehensive liberals don't want the state to be neutral, but they also deny that even that it just can't be done. So they don't want it, it can't exist. Because they'll say, they raise very valid questions, such as, isn't the ideal of a state neutral to conceptions of the good a representation of the good itself? Can you abstract neutrality from conceptions of the good? Isn't neutrality, if you say that neutrality is desirable, isn't that a statement about the good? So that's one thing. Also, isn't a liberal state a community? Isn't a liberal state a cultural, historical community that takes place in some countries? There's a very Burkean approach here, you know, when he was saying that there was no such thing as human rights or the rights of men, that they were the rights of the English, and trying to steal them and apply them to the French was mad, because that wasn't their community, basically, simply put. So you could say that liberalism always implies a vision of the good. Whether it is a vision of the good that is so thin that it happens to be shared, that it happens to be shared with other people, is almost another question. It's not neutral, it's just values that we all share. And here we're drifting towards the question of universalism, which I won't drift towards because I don't have the time to do that. But you see, this is what leading liberal theorists of the time, Rawls, also Dworkin, were looking for. They were looking for a way to define justice in a way that would be acceptable to everyone. For instance, Dworkin, who was insistent that autonomy was a very important value, managed to phrase what he believed to be a universal principle, you've got it there, from which he could assert that autonomy wasn't a liberal vision of the good, it was actually a good recognized by everyone else. Okay, so the effort that you put in your life, that's what matters. Okay, being good at what you do is what matters. We all agree. Okay, ergo, we need autonomy. Ergo, autonomy isn't a liberal value. It's a universal one. There you go. Anyway, let's admit that we can't have a neutral state, or that we can and we don't want to. How do we then decide what philosophical principles should guide the state? How we should organize the political sphere, the public sphere, what rules to decide on who's in charge, how late can pubs close, what films may or may not be shown, what curricula in schools, blah, 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 okay? Well, the communitarian answer is, it depends on the community, on their tradition, on their culture, on their history, on their choice as a community. Consensus is possible because it is based on shared understandings. Shared understandings is the product of history and culture. So goes the communitarian critique. And this takes me in my conclusion to my conclusion so far, the liberal critique of the neutrality of the state from the comprehensive liberal point of view. And I must say that in my humble opinion, the most convincing one is Brian Barry's. Brian Barry isn't as famous as the other political theorists I mentioned in passing today. I don't really understand why. I mean, I think it's because he's British and not American, but it's not a real reason. I think it's the actual reason. I as you might guess, I quite like him, and I like him so much that I've included a picture of him. Also, he has some kind of tragic life that I sort of relate to. Anyway, I think he's under research as well. He discards the idea of the neutrality of the state, and he has very sound criticisms, a very sound criticism for that. He denies the possibility of getting non-liberals to adhere to, and even to a thin, even to a skinny liberalism. He says that all this overlapping consensus means that people have to be sort of kind of liberals in advance. And he has a wonderful quote here. He says, and I'm quoting, "For a Roman Catholic to say, homosexuality is wrong, but that's just my private opinion, he or she must have swallowed a large dose of liberalism to begin with." And it's so true. People who think homosexuality is wrong tend to think it should be forbidden. If they reach the point where they think it's wrong, but they think that it should be tolerated, well, they're liberals. So the overlapping consensus is with other liberals who don't need the overlapping consensus, by the way. And people would think that homosexuality should be banned because it's wrong, even if it's not harmful to them. Non-liberals do not distinguish between harming, but they're not millions. They don't think that the only thing that should be banned is what can harm you, okay? The second reason that he puts forward is even more interesting. It's that the neutrality of the state is not only unattractive to non-liberals, it's actually non-attractive to liberals themselves. And what he says is people, liberals and non-liberals, people in general, do not treat moral conviction as a personal preference, like a personal taste. Whether homosexuality is wrong or right is not the same as whether you like chocolate and accept that other people don't like it. That's two very different things. These are two very different things. If liberals can speak of neutrality, it is because they morally believe in neutrality. So there aren't that many things that a liberal is going to find wrong to the point that it should be banned. This is the essence of being a liberal. Okay? This is why neutrality is something that they can contemplate. But if you hold another set of moral values, then you're far more likely to consider many things as morally wrong, and you will find that a neutral state goes against your values. So a neutral state favors liberals. It matches their own view of what the world should be. Also, you could say that you're making an effort to tolerate, as a comprehensive liberal, as a perfectionist, you're making an effort to tolerate people who you don't agree with, but nevertheless you believe that they have a right, blah, blah, blah. But I'll tell you one thing, says Brian Barry, when they'll be in power, they won't reciprocate. Okay? Once in power, other thick moralities do not remember the favor that was done to them by liberalism and return the favor. That's not what happens. Okay. Think Ron DeSantis. It's a great example of that. Okay. Anyway, last quote from one quote from Brian Barry, writing in 1991. Sorry, 1991. He says, under these conditions, the one I've just summed up, I do not think that liberals can afford the luxury of unilateral disarmament. Very likely, we are headed for a new dark age. And nothing philosophers of liberal persuasion can do will prevent it. But given the choice between trying to persuade non-liberals to accept the principle of neutrality and trying to discredit their beliefs, I think the second is clearly the better strategy. And I find that so fascinating that Brian Barry, in 1991, the heyday of liberalism, this is when Fukuyama wrote that history was over, you know, that this time liberalism had won the day. That was it. Okay, everyone was like, yay. But people, not only Barry, Habermas saw it as well, Hobsbawm, kind of, but Barry, I find it incredible that in 1991 he was saying we're heading to dark ages. I should say that he was a left-leaning liberal, and his analysis of the end of social justice led him to that conclusion, and he wasn't wrong once more. But anyway, he died in 2009. A lot of these people died. Dworkin died as well. Rawls died. Everyone's dead. Sorry. He died in 2009, so he did not see just how far authoritarianism, not say fascism, was making a comeback. But to see that he had seen it in advance, I find that fascinating, and this is my conclusion.
Thank you very, very, very much. I will stop the recording here.